Detective Chief Carlos Rivera had been having one of those long days that seemed to stretch on forever. He'd spent the entire afternoon at Jefferson Elementary School, talking to third graders about stranger safety and showing them around his police car. The kids had been adorable, asking him a million questions about his badge and whether he'd ever caught any bad guys. One little girl had even asked if she could be a police chief when she grew up, which made his heart swell with pride. After the school visit, he'd driven across town to meet with the neighborhood watch group on Pine Street. They'd been having issues with vandalism in their community park, and Carlos wanted to discuss increasing patrols in the area. The meeting had gone well, with residents sharing their concerns and working together on solutions. These were the moments that reminded him why he'd chosen this career path 22 years ago. Now, at 7:30 in the evening, Carlos was finally heading home to his wife Rosa and their 2 teenage daughters. He'd promised Rosa he'd be home in time for dinner, but like many nights in his line of work, that promise was looking harder to keep. At least tomorrow was Saturday, which meant he could make up for lost time with his family. The radio in his unmarked patrol car crackled occasionally with routine calls from dispatch, but nothing that required his immediate attention. Carlos drove through the familiar streets of his city, taking in the sights of neighborhoods he'd sworn to protect and serve. Some areas were rough around the edges, others were middle-class communities with neat lawns and picket fences, and then there were places like Oakwood Heights, where he was currently driving. Oakwood Heights was the kind of neighborhood where houses sold for $500,000, and homeowners associations made sure every lawn was perfectly manicured. Carlos didn't have anything against wealthy folks, but he'd noticed over the years that some people in these areas seemed to think their money made them better than everyone else. Still, they deserved the same protection and service as everyone else in the city. He was thinking about Rosa's famous enchiladas and wondering if she'd saved him a plate when he heard it. That unmistakable sound that every driver dreads, the rhythmic thumping that means you've got a flat tire. Carlos felt his heart sink as he pulled over to the side of Maple Street, right under a streetlight that cast long shadows across the tree-lined road. Just my luck, he muttered to himself as he turned on his hazard lights and stepped out of the car. The cool evening air hit his face as he walked around to inspect the damage. Sure enough, his rear passenger tire was completely flat, probably from the construction debris he'd noticed scattered along this stretch of road. The city had been working on water main repairs in this area for weeks. Carlos looked down at his clothes and sighed. He was wearing his usual community outreach outfit, a simple button-down shirt, khakis, and comfortable walking shoes. Nothing that screamed police chief to anyone who might pass by. His badge and identification were tucked safely in his wallet, and his service weapon was concealed under his jacket. To any casual observer, he probably looked like any other working guy dealing with car trouble. He opened his trunk and pulled out the spare tire, jack, and lug wrench. The tools felt familiar in his hands. He'd changed plenty of tires over the years, both on duty and off. Growing up in a working-class family, his father had taught him that a man should know how to fix things himself. You can't always depend on others to solve your problems, his dad used to say. It was advice that had served Carlos well throughout his life and career. As he began loosening the lug nuts, Carlos thought about how his evening was going to play out. Rosa would probably keep his dinner warm in the oven, and his daughters would tease him about being late again. 15-year-old Isabella would likely be buried in her homework, while 13-year-old Sophia would be practicing piano. The thought of his family waiting for him made him work a little faster. The neighborhood around him was quiet, with most residents already settled in for the evening. Porch lights glowed warmly in the windows of the large houses that lined both sides of the street. Carlos could see the flicker of television screens through some windows and hear the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere down the block. It was the kind of peaceful suburban scene that many people worked their whole lives to achieve. Carlos positioned the jack under the car frame and began raising the vehicle. The physical work felt good after a day spent mostly sitting in meetings and talking to people. There was something satisfying about solving a problem with your own 2 hands, even if it was just changing a tire. He'd always been the type of person who preferred action over endless discussion. As he worked, a few cars passed by on the street, their headlights briefly illuminating him before moving on. Most drivers didn't even slow down. After all, seeing someone changing a tire on the side of the road was hardly unusual. Carlos didn't mind the lack of attention. He was perfectly capable of handling this himself, and he'd be back on the road in 15 minutes at most. The evening was actually quite pleasant once you got past the inconvenience of the flat tire. The temperature was comfortable. There was a gentle breeze rustling through the oak trees that gave the neighborhood its name, and the street was well lit and safe. Carlos had dealt with car trouble in much worse circumstances during his years as a patrol officer. He thought about the presentation he'd given to the kids earlier that day. One of the things he'd told them was that police officers were just regular people who happened to have a job protecting their community. "We change tires and grocery shop and help our kids with homework just like your parents do," he'd explained to the wide-eyed children. If only they could see him now, he thought with a smile. The spare tire was in good condition, which was a relief. Carlos made a mental note to get the flat tire repaired this weekend and to check the air pressure in all his tires while he was at it. Regular maintenance was important, whether you were taking care of a car or running a police department. Small problems had a way of becoming big problems if you ignored them long enough. As he continued working, Carlos remained completely unaware that his quiet evening was about to take a very unexpected turn. Sometimes life has a way of testing us when we least expect it, and tonight would prove to be one of those tests. In just a few minutes, a simple tire change would become something much more complicated, challenging everything he believed about treating people with dignity and respect. The sound of a car door slamming broke the peaceful quiet of Maple Street. Carlos looked up from where he was removing the flat tire to see a woman walking toward him with quick, purposeful steps. Her high heels clicked against the asphalt with each stride, creating an almost musical rhythm in the evening air. The woman appeared to be in her late 40s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and clothing that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. She wore a tailored business suit that looked like it had just come from the dry cleaner, and her jewelry caught the light from the street lamp as she moved. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who was used to being in control and getting her way. "Excuse me?" she called out, her voice carrying a tone that immediately put Carlos on edge. It wasn't the tone of someone offering help or expressing genuine concern. It was the voice of someone who was annoyed and wanted everyone to know it. Carlos straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on an old rag he kept in his trunk. "Yes, ma'am," he replied politely, the way his mother had taught him to address all adults when he was growing up. The woman stopped about 10 feet away from him, close enough to talk but far enough to maintain what she clearly considered a safe distance. Her eyes swept over him, taking in his work clothes, his slightly sweaty appearance, and his older model sedan. Carlos could practically see the judgments forming in her mind. "You can't just park here and make a mess," she announced, crossing her arms in front of her chest. "This is a respectable neighborhood with standards. People work hard to keep property values up, and this kind of thing brings down the whole area." Carlos blinked in surprise. In all his years of dealing with the public, both as a patrol officer and as chief, he'd encountered plenty of difficult people. But it had been a while since someone had spoken to him with such obvious disdain right off the bat. "I apologize for any inconvenience, ma'am," he said calmly. "I have a flat tire and I'm changing it as quickly as I can. I'll be out of your way in just a few minutes." The woman, who later would introduce herself as Victoria Brennan, wasn't satisfied with his response. She looked at the tools scattered around the car and shook her head disapprovingly. "Do you even know what you're doing? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're just making things worse. You're probably going to damage the rim or strip the bolts or something." "I've changed quite a few tires in my time," Carlos replied, keeping his voice level despite the growing irritation he felt. "I appreciate your concern, but I've got everything under control." Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Your time? Let me guess. You probably learned how to do this in some shop class, right? Well, this isn't the kind of neighborhood where people fix their own cars on the street. We have service stations and mechanics for that sort of thing." Carlos felt his jaw tighten slightly, but he forced himself to remain professional. Throughout his career, he'd learned that some people seemed to take pleasure in looking down on others, and the best response was usually to stay calm and not give them the reaction they were looking for. "Ma'am, I understand this might be unusual for your neighborhood, but changing a tire is perfectly legal and sometimes necessary. I'm being as careful as possible with your street, and I'll clean up any mess when I'm finished." But Victoria was just getting started. She pulled out her smartphone and began taking pictures of Carlos, his car, and the tire-changing operation. "What's your name?" she demanded. I want to know who you are and why you think you can just set up shop on our street like this. The question caught Carlos off guard. In his position as police chief, he was used to people knowing who he was, or at least treating him with basic respect when they found out. But right now he was just a guy in work clothes dealing with car trouble, and this woman clearly saw him as someone beneath her notice. "I'm just trying to fix my tire and get home to my family," he said simply. "I'm not causing any trouble and I'll be gone shortly." Victoria's expression grew even more disdainful. "Your family, right? And I suppose they're waiting for you in some apartment complex across town. You people always have some sob story about family when you get caught where you don't belong." The phrase, "you people," hung in the air between them like a challenge. Carlos had heard those words before, and he knew exactly what they meant. He'd experienced prejudice throughout his life, sometimes subtle and sometimes not so subtle. But it never got easier to deal with. The difference now was that he had the authority and position to address it, except that this woman had no idea who he was. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you mean by you people, but I assure you I have every right to be on this public street," Carlos said, his voice taking on a slight edge despite his efforts to remain calm. Victoria stepped closer, emboldened by what she interpreted as weakness. "Oh, don't play innocent with me. I know exactly what's going on here. You probably drove through our neighborhood looking for houses to break into, and when your piece of junk car broke down, you figured you'd just make yourself at home." Carlos stopped working and stood up to his full height, which was considerable. At 6 feet 2 inches, he was an imposing figure when he wanted to be, but he kept his posture non-threatening. "Ma'am, that's a serious accusation and it's completely unfounded. I'm simply changing a tire." "Unfounded?" Victoria laughed again, that same harsh sound. "Look at you. Look at your car. You think I was born yesterday? I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, and I know who belongs here and who doesn't. And you definitely don't belong here." By now, lights were beginning to come on in some of the houses along the street. Curtains twitched as curious neighbors tried to see what was causing the commotion. Carlos noticed a few people standing on their porches, though they were too far away to hear the conversation clearly. "I understand you're concerned about your neighborhood," Carlos said, making one more attempt at reasonableness. "That's actually admirable. But I'm not a threat to anyone. I'm just a working man trying to get home after a long day." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "A working man? What kind of work? Let me guess, landscaping? Construction? Something with your hands, right? The kind of job that doesn't require much education or skill?" The condescension in her voice was unmistakable now. Carlos had spent decades working his way up through the ranks of law enforcement, earning a college degree in criminal justice, and later a master's degree in public administration. He'd attended countless training seminars, led community initiatives, and dedicated his life to serving others. But to this woman, he was just another laborer who didn't know his place. "There's nothing wrong with honest work, ma'am," Carlos replied quietly. "Every job has dignity if it's done well and helps others." "Help others?" Victoria scoffed. "Please, people like you are only out for yourselves. You probably don't even pay taxes, living off the system while the rest of us work hard to support your laziness." That accusation stung more than the others. Carlos had been paying taxes since his first job at 16, working part-time at a grocery store to help his family make ends meet. He'd served his country, his community, and his fellow citizens for more than 2 decades. But explaining any of that would require revealing who he was, and something told him it would be interesting to see how far this woman was willing to go with her assumptions. The evening air had grown cooler, and Carlos could feel the sweat from his earlier work beginning to chill on his skin. But the discomfort was nothing compared to the frustration building inside him as he listened to this stranger tear apart his character based on nothing more than his appearance, and the fact that his car had broken down in her neighborhood. Victoria wasn't finished with her verbal assault. If anything, Carlos's calm responses seemed to make her angrier, as if his refusal to get defensive was somehow proving her point. She began pacing back and forth in front of his car, her heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown timer. "You know what really bothers me?" she continued, gesturing wildly with her manicured hands. "It's this entitled attitude. You think you can just show up anywhere and do whatever you want, and the rest of us are supposed to just accept it. Well, I've got news for you. Some of us actually care about maintaining standards." Carlos continued working on changing the tire, hoping that finishing the job quickly would end this uncomfortable encounter. But Victoria seemed determined to make her point, whatever that point was supposed to be. "I bet you don't even have insurance," she said, pulling out her phone again and taking more pictures. "That's probably why you're changing the tire yourself instead of calling roadside assistance like a normal person would. Can't afford the service call, can you?" The assumption was so far off base that Carlos almost smiled despite his growing frustration. As police chief, he had excellent insurance coverage, including comprehensive roadside assistance. He was changing the tire himself because it was faster, and because he actually enjoyed working with his hands. But explaining that would require a conversation he wasn't ready to have yet. "Ma'am, I really think you're making a lot of assumptions about someone you don't know," Carlos said as he aligned the spare tire with the wheel bolts. "Maybe we could just let me finish this job and be on my way." Victoria's response was to laugh loudly enough that several neighbors came out onto their porches to get a better look at what was happening. "Assumptions? I'm making observations based on facts. Fact number 1, you don't live in this neighborhood. Fact number 2, your car is old and beat up. Fact number 3, you're doing manual labor on a public street. What am I supposed to think? You could think that I'm a human being deserving of basic respect," Carlos replied quietly, not looking up from his work. That comment seemed to set something off in Victoria. Her voice rose to a level that everyone within 100 yards could hear clearly. "Respect? You want respect? Then maybe you should try earning it instead of expecting it to be handed to you. Respect comes from hard work, education, and contributing to society. It comes from following rules and being a productive member of the community." Carlos finished tightening the lug nuts and stood up slowly. The irony of her lecture about contributing to society wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his entire adult life serving the public, often putting his own safety at risk to protect people like her. But she saw his work clothes and his ethnicity and decided he was worthless. "I work plenty hard, ma'am," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Probably harder than you might imagine." Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please. Working hard at what? I'm sure whatever you do, it's not exactly rocket science. Probably something that anyone could do with a strong back and a willingness to sweat." By now, quite a few neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by Victoria's increasingly loud voice and dramatic gestures. Carlos noticed that most of them looked uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them, but none seemed willing to intervene. A few were recording the confrontation with their phones, though from their distance, they probably couldn't hear all the details of what Victoria was saying. "Look around you," Victoria continued, sweeping her arm to indicate the expensive houses lining the street. "These are the homes of doctors, lawyers, business executives, and other professionals. People who went to college, who worked their way up in their careers, who contribute meaningfully to society. That's the kind of neighborhood this is." Carlos glanced at the gathering crowd and felt a familiar weight of responsibility. Even in this moment, even while being verbally attacked by someone who didn't know the first thing about him, he felt the need to maintain his dignity and set a good example. Somewhere in that crowd might be children watching, learning about how adults should treat each other. Education and professional success are wonderful things, Carlos agreed, but they don't make someone better than anyone else. And they certainly don't give anyone the right to treat others poorly. Victoria's face flushed red with anger. "Don't you dare lecture me about treating people poorly. I'm trying to protect my community from people who don't belong here. That's called being a responsible citizen." "Protecting your community from what exactly?" Carlos asked, genuinely curious to hear her answer. "From someone changing a tire? From the kind of people who bring crime and problems wherever they go?" Victoria shot back without hesitation. "From people who don't respect property values and neighborhood standards. From people who think the rules don't apply to them." The conversation had taken a turn that made Carlos's stomach clench. Victoria wasn't just being classist or judgmental. Her comments were veering into territory that was much more serious. As police chief, he'd spent years working to build trust between law enforcement and communities of color, trying to overcome decades of misunderstanding and prejudice. Now he was experiencing that prejudice firsthand. "Ma'am, you don't know anything about me or what kind of person I am," Carlos said, his patience finally beginning to wear thin. "You're making judgments based on nothing but your own biases." Victoria stepped closer, pointing an accusatory finger at him. "Biases? I'll tell you what my bias is. It's in favor of law-abiding, tax-paying citizens who respect the communities they live in. It's in favor of people who work legitimate jobs and don't cause trouble for their neighbors. And you've decided I don't fit into any of those categories based on what? Carlos challenged her. Based on the color of my skin? Based on the clothes I'm wearing? Based on the fact that my car broke down in your neighborhood? The directness of his question seemed to catch Victoria off guard for a moment, but she quickly recovered. I've decided you don't belong here based on evidence, based on common sense, based on experience with your type. My type? Carlos repeated, and there was something in his voice now that made several of the watching neighbors take a step closer. And what type would that be exactly? Victoria glanced around at the growing crowd, suddenly seeming to realize that her words were being heard by more people than just Carlos. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her position. The type that causes problems, she said defiantly. The type that brings down property values and makes decent people afraid to walk their own streets. The type that honest, hard-working families have to worry about. Carlos felt something shift inside him. Throughout his career, he'd always tried to see the best in people, to give them the benefit of the doubt, to believe that understanding and education could overcome prejudice. But standing here listening to Victoria's venomous words, he realized that some people were so committed to their hatred that no amount of patience or reasoning would change their minds. Ma'am, he said quietly, I think this conversation has gone far enough. I'm going to finish cleaning up here and be on my way. But Victoria wasn't ready to let him go. In fact, she was just getting started with what would turn out to be the biggest mistake of her evening. Victoria pulled out her phone with a flourish that suggested she thought she was about to deliver the final blow in their confrontation. You know what? She announced loudly enough for all the gathered neighbors to hear. I'm calling the police. They'll know exactly how to handle this situation. Carlos paused in his tire cleanup and looked at her with genuine curiosity. You're calling the police because I changed a tire? I'm calling the police because you're loitering in our neighborhood, being hostile and aggressive and refusing to leave when asked, Victoria declared, already dialing. For all I know, you're casing houses for break-ins or dealing drugs or who knows what else. The accusations were so outrageous that Carlos almost laughed. In his 22 years of law enforcement, he'd dealt with actual criminals, real threats to public safety, and genuine emergencies. The idea that changing a tire could be construed as criminal activity was absurd, but Victoria seemed completely serious about her call. Inawan, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was clear enough in the quiet evening air that Carlos could hear both sides of the conversation. Yes, I need to report a suspicious person in the Oakwood Heights neighborhood, Victoria said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who believed she was performing an important civic duty. There's a man here who's been loitering on Maple Street, and he's being very aggressive and threatening toward residents. Carlos raised an eyebrow at the word aggressive. Throughout their entire interaction, he'd remained calm and polite, even as Victoria had hurled increasingly personal insults at him. If anyone had been aggressive, it certainly wasn't him. Can you describe the individual, ma'am? The dispatcher asked. He's Hispanic, probably in his 40s, wearing work clothes. He claims he's changing a tire, but he's been here for a long time, making a mess and bothering people. He's driving an old sedan that doesn't belong in this neighborhood. Carlos listened with professional interest to Victoria's description. As someone who'd taken thousands of similar calls over the years, he knew that dispatchers were trained to ask specific questions and gather detailed information. He also knew that the description she was giving would likely ring some bells in the dispatch center. Ma'am, can you give me the exact address where this is occurring? The dispatcher continued. Victoria rattled off the street address with confidence. And I want you to know that several neighbors are concerned about this individual. We've never seen him before, and his behavior is very suspicious. I think he might be using the tire story as an excuse to case our homes for burglaries. There was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than usual for a 911 call. Carlos could imagine the dispatcher checking various databases and cross-referencing information. He wondered how long it would take for someone to put the pieces together. Ma'am, I need you to stay on the line for a moment, the dispatcher said carefully. Can you tell me again exactly what this individual is doing right now? He's still messing around with his car, but he keeps stopping to argue with me. He's been very rude and confrontational, and honestly, I'm starting to feel threatened by his behavior." Carlos almost did laugh at that. Victoria had been the one approaching him, the one raising her voice, the one making accusations and taking pictures. He'd done nothing but try to change his tire and respond politely to her increasingly hostile comments. "Ma'am," the dispatcher said, and there was something different in the tone now. "I need to ask you to describe the vehicle again. You said it was an older sedan?" "Yes. Some kind of generic car, probably 10 years old at least. The kind of car that someone with no money would drive." Another pause. "And you said the man is Hispanic, approximately 40 years old, wearing casual work clothes?" "That's right. Why are you asking so many questions? Just send someone out here to deal with this before the situation gets worse." Carlos could see some of the neighbors shifting uncomfortably, perhaps beginning to realize that Victoria's characterization of events didn't match what they'd witnessed. He'd been nothing but calm and professional throughout the encounter, while Victoria had been the one creating a scene. "Ma'am, I'm going to send units to your location right away," the dispatcher said. "But I need to inform you of something important. Based on your description and the location, you may be speaking with Chief Carlos Rivera of our police department. He was scheduled to be in that area this evening, and your description matches him exactly." The silence that followed was so complete that Carlos could hear the distant sound of traffic from the main road several blocks away. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then a dawning horror as the implications sank in. "What did you say?" she whispered into the phone. "Chief Rivera is our police chief, ma'am. If this is indeed him, then you've been speaking with the head of our police department." Victoria's hand began to shake as she held the phone. She looked at Carlos with new eyes, taking in details she'd apparently missed before. The confident way he carried himself, the authoritative but calm manner in which he'd handled her verbal attacks, the fact that he'd remained professional even under extreme provocation. But he doesn't look like," Victoria started to say, then stopped herself as she realized how that sentence was going to end. "Doesn't look like what, ma'am?" the dispatcher asked. I made a mistake," Victoria said weakly. "I think I may have misunderstood the situation." By now the gathered neighbors had caught enough of the conversation to realize what was happening. Word began to spread quickly through the crowd, with people whispering to each other and pointing at Carlos with new understanding. Some looked embarrassed, others appeared relieved that the confrontation was finally making sense. Carlos watched Victoria's face carefully, seeing the exact moment when the full weight of her actions hit her. She'd spent the better part of 30 minutes verbally abusing the chief of police, making assumptions about his character, his background, his work ethic, and his right to be in the neighborhood. She'd accused him of being a criminal, called him uneducated, and suggested he was a threat to public safety. "Ma'am, are you still there?" the dispatcher asked. "Yes, I'm here," Victoria replied, her voice barely audible now. "Chief Rivera, if that's you, could you please identify yourself to the caller?" Carlos stepped forward and spoke clearly enough for Victoria's phone to pick up his voice. "This is Chief Carlos Rivera, badge number 1-1. I can confirm my identity when the units arrive." Victoria's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she had to lean against her BMW for support. The phone slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered onto the asphalt, where the dispatcher's voice could be heard asking if anyone was still on the line. "Ma'am," Carlos said gently, "I think you might want to pick up your phone. The dispatcher is trying to talk to you." But Victoria couldn't move. She stood frozen, staring at Carlos as if seeing him for the first time, which in many ways she was. The man she'd dismissed as an uneducated laborer was the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the city. The person she'd accused of being a criminal was the one responsible for fighting crime throughout the community. The individual she'd suggested didn't belong in the neighborhood was someone who dedicated his life to protecting neighborhoods just like this one. The sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder by the second. Within minutes, this quiet residential street would be filled with police cars, and Victoria would have to face the consequences of her actions in front of all her neighbors and the officers who worked under Carlos's command. As the sirens grew closer, Carlos felt a mix of emotions. Part of him was angry at the treatment he'd received, but another part felt sorry for Victoria, who was clearly realizing the magnitude of her mistake. This was about to become a teaching moment for everyone involved, whether they wanted it or not. 3 patrol cars arrived on Maple Street within minutes, their red and blue lights painting the evening scene in alternating colors. The officers who stepped out of the vehicles moved with the practiced efficiency of professionals, but Carlos could see the barely contained amusement in their eyes as they took in the situation. Sergeant Lisa Chen, a 15-year veteran of the force, approached first. She was one of Carlos's most trusted officers, someone who'd worked her way up through the ranks with dedication and skill. "Good evening, Chief Rivera," she said with perfect professional composure, though her eyes were twinkling. "We received a report of a suspicious individual in the area. Should we investigate?" Carlos couldn't help but smile at her deadpan delivery. "Well, Sergeant Chen, I suppose that depends on how suspicious you find tire changing to be these days." Officer Tony Martinez, a newer member of the force, stepped forward with a wide grin. "Chief, we could arrest the suspicious individual for illegal tire maintenance if you'd like. I've got my handcuffs ready." The gentle humor from his officers helped ease some of the tension Carlos had been feeling. Throughout the entire confrontation with Victoria, he'd maintained his professionalism, but it hadn't been easy. Being judged and dismissed based on his appearance was something he'd experienced before, but it never got less frustrating. Victoria, meanwhile, had managed to retrieve her phone from the pavement, though her hands were still shaking. She stood next to her BMW like someone waiting for a judgment to be passed, which in many ways she was. The neighbors who had gathered to watch the confrontation were now murmuring among themselves, and Carlos could only imagine what they were saying. "Mrs. Brennan," Carlos said, having learned her name from one of the neighbors. "I think we need to have a conversation." Victoria nodded wordlessly, unable to meet his eyes. The confident, aggressive woman who had spent the last half hour attacking his character was gone, replaced by someone who looked utterly defeated. "First, let me say that I don't hold any personal grudges about what happened here tonight," Carlos began, his voice carrying the authority of his position, but also a note of genuine kindness. "People make mistakes, and people sometimes make assumptions that turn out to be wrong." Victoria looked up at him with surprise, clearly expecting anger or retribution. "But," Carlos continued, "what happened here tonight was more than just a simple misunderstanding. The things you said, the assumptions you made, the way you treated someone you saw as beneath you, that reveals something about how you view the world and the people in it." Sergeant Chen and the other officers listened intently. They all knew Carlos as a fair but firm leader, someone who believed in teachable moments and second chances, but who also wouldn't tolerate discrimination or prejudice. "Mrs. Brennan, you saw a man in work clothes changing a tire, and you immediately assumed he was uneducated, unemployed, probably criminal, and definitely not worthy of basic human respect. You made those judgments without knowing anything about me except what I looked like and the fact that my car had broken down in your neighborhood." Victoria's face crumpled, and tears began to form in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I don't know what came over me. I was having a stressful day and I wasn't thinking clearly." Carlos nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate the apology, ma'am, but I want you to understand something important. The way you treated me tonight, that's how you would have treated anyone who looked like me, regardless of their job or education or character. That's not about having a bad day. That's about having biases that need to be examined and changed." Officer Martinez stepped forward. "Chief, we've been getting some concerned calls from other neighbors. Apparently, Mrs. Brennan has made similar complaints about other people in the area over the past few months." Carlos wasn't surprised to hear this. In his experience, the kind of prejudice Victoria had displayed rarely happened in isolation. It was usually part of a pattern of behavior, a way of seeing the world that affected multiple interactions over time. "Mrs. Brennan," Carlos said seriously, "I want you to think about something. Tonight you called the police on someone who was doing absolutely nothing wrong. You made false accusations about criminal behavior. You disrupted a peaceful neighborhood evening. And you did all of this because someone you didn't recognize was changing a tire on a public street." Victoria was crying openly now, the weight of her actions finally sinking in completely. "I know," she sobbed. "I know I was wrong. I don't know how to make this right." Carlos exchanged glances with his officers. This was the moment that would determine whether tonight became just another story of conflict or an opportunity for real change and growth. "Here's what's going to happen," Carlos said firmly. "First, you're going to go home tonight and think seriously about the assumptions you made and why you made them. Second, you're going to attend our next community policing meeting and participate in a discussion about building trust and understanding between neighbors." Victoria nodded eagerly, clearly relieved that she wasn't being arrested or facing more serious consequences. "But most importantly," Carlos continued, "you're going to volunteer for our community outreach program. You're going to spend time working with people from different backgrounds, learning about their lives and their struggles and their contributions to our community, because the only way to overcome prejudice is through understanding and personal connection." Sergeant Chen smiled at this suggestion. She'd seen Carlos use this approach before, turning negative encounters into opportunities for education and growth. It didn't always work, but when it did, it created lasting change that benefited everyone involved. "Chief Rivera," Victoria said through her tears, "I want you to know that I'm truly ashamed of my behavior tonight. I was raised better than this, and I know my actions don't reflect the person I want to be." Carlos studied her face carefully, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus simple embarrassment at being caught. What he saw was someone who seemed genuinely shocked by her own capacity for cruelty, someone who was being forced to confront an ugly side of herself that she might have preferred to ignore. "Mrs. Brennan, we all have biases and prejudices. The difference between good people and bad people isn't whether those biases exist. It's what we do when we become aware of them. Tonight could be the beginning of you becoming a better person, if you choose to let it be." As the officers began to clear the scene and the gathered neighbors started returning to their homes, Carlos finished putting away his tire-changing tools. The spare tire wasn't perfect, but it would get him home safely to Rosa and the girls. Victoria approached him one more time as he was closing his trunk. "Chief Rivera, I know this probably doesn't mean much coming from me, but thank you for handling this with such grace. A lot of people would have made this situation much worse for me than you did." Carlos looked at her thoughtfully. "Mrs. Brennan, I've spent my entire career trying to build bridges between people and communities. Tonight was a test of whether I really believe in what I preach. I hope it was a test for you too, and I hope we both passed." As Carlos drove home through the quiet streets of his city, he thought about the events of the evening. He was tired, hungry, and emotionally drained from the confrontation. But he was also hopeful. If Victoria followed through on her commitment to change, then maybe some good would come from this difficult encounter. When he pulled into his driveway, Rosa was waiting for him on the front porch. She took one look at his face and knew something significant had happened. "Rough night?" she asked as she hugged him. "Educational," Carlos replied. "Very educational." 3 weeks later, Victoria Brennan attended her first community policing meeting. She listened more than she spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and signed up to volunteer at the local community center. It was a small step, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, Carlos thought, beginnings are the most important thing of all.